Hello, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie getting back to you with this week's lesson from our New Testament class from Jerome United Methodist Church. It's a pleasure to uh, get relay this to everyone, to the mothers out there. We're taping this on Saturday night. Be Happy Mother's Day tomorrow. And if you don't listen to it till later, I understand, then Happy Mother's Day post facto. We're talking about the second half of Romans, chapters 9 through 16. And it's interesting because as important as Romans is in Christian teaching, the second half of the book, in my experience, does not get a lot of attention in our modern churches. And maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't, but I don't remember it being emphasized at all in my many, many years and going to church and teaching Sunday school and all that. And it's because the message is quite different, and it's a message that is meaningful to me. It may not be popular with certain aspects of modern U.S. Christian churches. And so he begins in chapter 9 and 10 with struggling with the questions around where is the role of Judaism and the role of Jewish Christians in what then was the modern emerging first century Christian movement. And he struggles with the bit of a conflict between, yes, the Israelites, as he calls them, the Jews, are still the chosen people. God does not turn his back on them. God does not reject them. But the attempt to command good, perfect behavior from them by this relatively intricate law clearly doesn't work. The law only condemns. It points out to us our weaknesses that we have, and all of us certainly have lots of weaknesses. And so Jesus was sent down as the fulfillment of the law, the fulfillment of the promise to take this faith throughout the whole world. And that the modern salvation, the only salvation, is through faith in Jesus Christ. So it's tricky because the Greeks had relied on reason, logic, rationality. And that doesn't answer questions either, because life is not logical. Life is not reasonable. Humans are not logical or reasonable. And so the only way to get around our weaknesses, because we certainly all have them, let's be very clear, I have lots of them, are through faith in Jesus Christ and the saving grace that God gives us, grants to us because of our faith in Jesus Christ. And he struggles with the question of what this means for the Hebrew people who don't become Christians and who don't swing over to the salvation faith. And it's difficult on him. You can see his emotion involved because he grew up as a very Jewish person, born to the law, circumcised on the eighth day like you were supposed to, a Pharisee, well schooled in the law. And he now realized in his Christian experience that isn't enough, that isn't suitable for salvation. So you can see him feeling pain of his people that haven't come over to being Christians. He does continue to emphasize that this is a new thing, that in the universality of Christianity, the Greek Christians, or Hellenist Christians as he calls them, and the Jewish Christians have to blend together into this one faith. So it requires each of them giving up what they came from to adapt and adopt the new faith. So it's very, very interesting. And you can see his discomfort about what's going to happen to the Jewish people, his brethren that did not accept this new faith. He does go back and looks to the second part of Isaiah. If you're familiar with Isaiah, Isaiah as the prophet comes in three sections. The first Isaiah is about 1 through 38 or 39. And that's written during the time of the existence of the kingdom of Judah. Second Isaiah was added much later, and it's from about verse 39 or chapter 39 or 40 up to about 55. And that's clearly written during the Babylonian exile. And that's where the prophet who wrote this, whoever that was, came to the logical but powerful conclusion. Hey, if there's only one God, that means we Israelites have to share this God with everybody. Because if there's only one God, it can't just be our exclusive God, which was the very ancient impression that the Hebrews had, that their God was better than the others, and they could have only one God, and there was going to be stronger than the other gods out there. Did not deny the existence of other gods until you get along to Isaiah, and Isaiah says, wait a minute, there's one God. If there's only one, then it's the God of everyone, even our enemies, even the people we don't like. He didn't say it that way, but that's what it means. So this emergence of Christianity is an evolution from that point that Paul's aware of, that this becomes the God of everybody, and therefore we've got to adapt the teaching of it so we can explain this to everybody. And that really takes him up through chapter 11 in this. When you get to chapter 12, you get to a series of exhortations about Christian behavior. He talks about spiritual worship, which is really what we're doing now. Even though we've stopped the church services, we have home church in our family, and where we sing hymns and do prayer and have a scripture lesson and other types of spiritual guidance, and which is really what the first century Christians did. We've gone back to the past. And he stresses humility. And humility is a very important thing, and it's very tricky because capable people, the sin of pride is the big weakness on capable people. And I spent 40 years in academic medicine where the sin of pride is encouraged and fostered. To boast on yourself and be prideful and be greedy, but those are two of the seven deadly sins. Those are the two more powerful ones. And Paul is against that. He said, you got to stress your humility because if you're not humble, you're not going to be generous and loving toward the people you deal with. They're going to be put off by your smugness and your arrogance. He doesn't say it in those ways, but that's what he means. And you need to be humble in your humility, even in your Christianity. And so, in my observation, that's scarce in many contemporary leadership people in all fields, particularly in church leadership. Church leaders have to be very careful. They need to recognize that they commit the same sins everybody else does. And people think, that lust is the worst sin. Lust can be the really worst sin for certain people of the seven deadly sins. Greed is a huge one, and it's a curse in modern American society. And in capable people like church leaders, pride is the big one, in my opinion, where you get too full of yourself. You think because you think this, you're therefore right, and you get to interpret things, and you get to tell people what to do. So he's really cautioning very much against that. He said you have to be. He talks about the spiritual gifts. He does that much more completely in 1 Corinthians. But there's teachers and there's rational people and there's prophecy people, and you have to be comfortable with your spiritual gift, which is a very good point because all of us in church don't have skills in all the other ways. And I'm a talker, not a singer, so I don't have any musical skills. But that's a very good point to remember for all of us to stay within our lane and be comfortable with that. But we need to be loving, hardworking, and charitable. This is very, very challenging. It's hard to be charitable toward people you don't like. That you don't curse your enemies, you bless your enemies. You don't respond with hostility back. He also makes the point that there's no value to social standing, which again is a very important thing. Coming out of academic medicine, social standing was extremely important. That you should never return evil for evil. Jesus said it, that when they offer you one cheek, to strike you on one cheek, offer them the other one also. That you should offer food to your enemies if they're struggling and hungry, not revenge. And bless your enemies that way. And it's a very good example in 20th century history. If you look at 20th century history, at the end of World War I, in 1918, 1919, through the summer of 1919, they had a treaty, the treaty at Versailles outside Paris, where they came up with a treaty that was severely punishing the Germans. And they punished the Germans severely, created all kinds of internal problems in Germany, poverty, inflation, angst, and all this. And then 20 years, almost to the week, about 6 weeks after, 20 years after the treaty was invoked, Hitler started World War II. And World War II was 5 times more deadly. About 50 million people died instead of 10 million people died in World War I. And the Americans had enough sense after the end of World War II to take the opposite attack. We were not going to punish the Germans and the Japanese. We specifically punished a few isolated number of war criminals, but we helped rebuild the structure, the economy, the government, and the culture of Germany and Japan. So in that end, we created two very strong democracies that are our friends. So it's a very good example in modern life in which a way which you wouldn't think about it, where positive Christian approach of loving your enemies, of being generous and kind, really paid off and has kept the world in much greater peace for a long, long time. And you master evil with good. You don't master it with further evil. It's a very interesting point that I've never heard stressed in church, the obedience to civil authorities. Paul says that God has put the civil authorities in power. He has empowered them to do this, and you are supposed to work with the civil authorities and not oppose them. It's a very interesting, and I've never heard it said from the pulpit. It's not a particularly popular idea in U.S. Christianity right now, that civil authority was established by God, and we therefore should respect it, and we need to observe it. I think as we forget our humility, get too prideful, we think that we need to take our values and force them on other people in the society. You got to be very careful with this one. One is, what makes you right? Just because you believe it doesn't mean you're right. It's just you can be passionate, not necessarily right. And a good example of how badly this can go is a minority of the country in the 1910s and early 20s forced prohibition on the country. Now, I'm a non-drinker, so it doesn't bother me if they didn't have alcohol, but it bothered a lot of people. And so it really created the organized crime and the mafia. It made them wealthy and powerful, and led to tremendous corruption. So you got to be very careful on trying to impose your own standards on other people. What you do is you lead by love and generosity and kindness and magnanimity toward people. So in the previous century, the 19th century, the church was very successful, leading positively, not by trying to control the government and force legal things, but by using moral authority to say, hey, we need to take care of the poor. We started poorhouses and orphanages and all that. We need to free the slaves, which was a very moral argument. We needed to have the rights for the native populations, but the churches led those, but they didn't try to take over the government. So I would caution people about this one. If you look back, there's no support in getting involved too politically anywhere in the New Testament. Jesus was very clear to render unto Caesar things that are Caesar and to God the things that are God's. And you got to be really careful here, because if you get too strident in being political, the politicians will just take advantage of you and use you and make a chump out of you. I even saw them do that. Nixon did that to Billy Graham and Billy Graham is an honorable Christian gentleman, but he got snookered in by Nixon before the Watergate thing, and found out during Watergate how what happens to you when you side with the politicians. They just use you, and they make a chump out of you and cast you aside when it's later. So it's a very interesting thing in the New Testament that's not stressed anywhere. So remember this. It's in the scriptures. Paul's saying, don't do this. Don't try to usurp the civil authorities. Obey them. Don't argue with them. And particularly, don't pass judgment on other people. When you talk about your Christian values, let your armor be the Lord Jesus. Welcome those who are different than you are. Understand that people have different opinions about things. Most of the things we fight about in church are trivial. They really don't matter. That if you've got faith and you live your faith and you love each other, all the other things about how you serve communion or whether you believe in predestination or not, or which hymns you sing and what music you know, most of those things people fight about aren't worth the effort, and it really is subverting it. So it's all in here. It's very, very interesting, and nobody seems to talk about it. So don't pass judgment on each other. In those days, in Paul's time, they fought over food. What food could you eat? It's different now. We don't fight over kosher or other things like that. Remember that the saving justice of faith in Jesus Christ is what is important, not how you eat, where you sit, what hymns you sing, other things like that. and those who are strong, who are comfortable in the faith, should recognize that there'll be a lot around who are weaker, who won't have a strong faith, and instead of lording it over them or being critical of them or putting them down, support them instead. Show them love, show them generosity, bolster them up. Accept one another for what we are, with our own weaknesses. And we need to forgive our weaknesses, both in ourselves and other people. Paul particularly encouraged the Jewish and Gentile Christians not to bicker. And that's tough. Every church I've been into, somebody's bickering with somebody about something, usually pretty nonsensical things. So he urged them to put that aside. Then he drops into the last couple chapters with an explanation of his plans. He was clearly writing this from Corinth because he sends greetings from Erastus. Erastus was the treasurer of the city of Corinth in Greece, so that Paul's ministry wasn't just to people at the bottom. He had a lot of middle and upper middle class and powerful people that became Christians under his ministry. And so he explains how he's going to go back to Jerusalem, taking support that's been donated back to the Jewish Christian church in Jerusalem to support them. As we said last week, Jerusalem is not a wealthy area in those days, not good farmland and all that. So they would support them from the wealthy Greek Christians scattered through the Aegean. And then he'll go on and he leave there. His plan was to stop in Rome and visit this church and go on to Spain. And then he sends greetings from his companions. Phoebe, who's a deaconess, a female, is going to carry the letter. And then he sends greetings to Prisca and Aquila. It's interesting. This is a married couple who are in Ephesus, which is across the Aegean from Corinth, where he probably wrote this. It's interesting, two things. One is he names the woman first, as if she's the more important player in that family. But he also was sending greetings directly to them. It makes me wonder, which I've never heard anyone suggest, is that quite possibly he had multiple copies of this letter made up. One to go to Rome, one to go to Corinth, one to go one to go to Ephesus, one maybe down to Antioch, another one to go back to Jerusalem. This may have explained this little insight in there. Why is he sending greetings to people that are in a different town across the water? That maybe they copied these letters, made multiple copies, and passed them around to the churches, particularly with this letter, which really wasn't specific for problems in the Roman church. It was kind of a letter of greeting. So it makes me wonder if Paul was starting to distribute his letters anyway, because within about 60 years, other Christian writers, Paul would be gone by that time, were referring to his writings as scripture. So they may have been passed around amongst the churches, even by Paul. He may have had multiple copies made and sent to other churches, and there's a hint there about that. He sends greetings to Epaphroditus, who was the first convert from Asia. Now remember, Asia in those days was up the area in the northwest corner of Turkey, just south of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, and the area where Troy was, and that was a small province of Asia. And then he sends greetings to a Herodian, from Herodian, his kinsman. It's the only reference I've seen anywhere in Paul's letters specifically from him to a kinsman. Now there was a reference in the latter part of Acts about how his nephew helped save him from being attacked as he held a prisoner in Rome. He sends greetings to Rufus, and the rumor is that Rufus was the son of Simon of Cyrene. If you remember that, Simon of Cyrene was the person who grabbed to made carry Jesus' cross because he'd been so badly beaten that he couldn't carry his cross. He continues to warn people against those who may stir up dissension. It's not clear what he means. Most likely, he means watch out for the people that are going to come along and tell you have to start obeying Jewish law, the Judaizers as they're called, if you're going to be Christians. Then you have greetings from Timothy, who was a regular traveling companion, Tertius, who identifies himself as the scribe. This is not the kind of letter that Paul, with his difficulty with vision, would write the whole thing out himself. Again, Erastus, the treasurer of Corinth, a very prominent person, the city treasurer. And this also shows that his followers were not necessarily at the bottom of society. His ministry was to these sophisticated churches along the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, and down into Greece and that area. And so he shows that his ministry was it was an urban ministry, how Jesus was dealt primarily with rural people in early in his career. Paul's dealing with these urban ministries through here. And then he closes and wishes them well. So this is a very important letter. It's got a lot of things in it that we need to pay attention to that we usually don't pay attention to, which is obedience to civil authorities, controlling ourselves, being magnanimous to our enemies, being generous to our enemies, loving those that we have difficulty with, staying within our spiritual gifts, and particularly not getting involved in the bickering that has been a part of any church anywhere in the world at any time. We're going to stop here. This will finish our time with Romans. We'll go into 1 Corinthians next several weeks. The Corinthian letters are very, very different, quite complicated, and very, very important in structuring modern Christianity. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie. Thank you very much.